Hello, welcome to another edition of Dr. Bickmore's YA Wednesday in Conversation. And today my guest is Jamie Hoang, who has a wonderful new book that I discovered at the summit this year. It was hosted by Oklahoma State and Aquinas College. And she was on a wonderful panel with two other writers, and we may talk a little bit about their collaboration as well. But I'm so glad to have you part of this conversation.
Thank you. Me too. I'm excited to be here. I'm really excited to talk about this book. Um, this is the book, My Father the Panda Killer. It's been a long journey to get here, so I really love discussing the book and talking about, you know, how it came to be and my history with the book. So thank you
Well,
for
let's
having
talk
me.
about that right away then. I mean, because this book is lovely. It has a beautiful cover. It's a great story. It's one of those books that um, I'm a quick reader, but once I start reading something, it's hard to put them down if I really. And sometimes as an academic, I'm reading 3 or 4 books at a time. I can put this one down. I'll be back. But yours was one. Nope, I'm in it. I'm in it. So
Yay! Yeah.
I'm sold. So tell us a little bit about the history of the book, your relationship to its principal characters, because people are automatically going to assume it's absolute biography, and we know that it's influenced by your life, but absolute biography, I'm not sure that's the case, right?
Yeah, so I started, I probably have been writing this book for over 20 years in various different forms. I wrote it as a short story, I wrote it as a screenplay. I was really trying to find a doorway in, and it took me a long time to figure out how I wanted to tell this story, particularly because so for anyone who doesn't know what the story is about, My Father the Panda Killer is a dual narrative story about Jane, who's a 17-year-old a teenager growing up in the 90s with an abusive father. And then simultaneously, you're getting the father's journey from Vietnam to America as a Vietnamese refugee. And all throughout my life, I've sort of known that like I wanted to tell the civilian Vietnamese story. Um, but I wanted to be really cognizant of the fact that I was not a refugee and that there are people who are my parents' age alive now who are better equipped to tell that story. So at the front of the book, you can see like um, it says, this book is not a history lesson. And in part, it's not that the book doesn't have historical elements to it. It's just that for me as a second gen Vietnamese American, it was really important for me to highlight the fact that there is a disconnect between the first gen and the second gen um, Vietnamese who are in America today. And in large part, that's because of a lack of communication. Um, my parents in particular, when they first got to America, they were working 18, 20 hours a day, and I didn't see them very much. So we had dinners together, and of course I felt their like love through the sacrifices they were making for us, but we didn't have a lot of conversations and we never talked about the war. My parents, it was just sort of like this is our history, and you know, they didn't I think they were maybe in some ways trying to shield us from it, but also maybe just didn't want to talk about it because it's painful for them.
Yeah.
And so um I really wanted to explore this idea of, what it's like to be a second gen um, Vietnamese American who's trying to learn your history and gathering facts, but getting them secondhand and learning about your parents through not your parents, but your cousins, or, reading about the history and not finding your family in the history books. Um, so yeah, that's kind of how this book came to be. Once I sort of realized that I wanted to make sure that this narrative was wholly from Jane's perspective, but also included the facts that she learned about her family throughout this one summer. It really opened up the possibilities for me because it felt like a truly authentic story for me to be able to tell.
Yeah, and you have some scenes, not to give things away in the plot, but you have some scenes where the main character Jane is kind of overhearing conversations with people who might be labeled as really uncles or adopted uncles and cousins, and all those conversations are really interesting about how they break down the barriers of miscommunication that might exist within a nuclear family, but the extended family has all these other versions of the story. And
Yeah.
that's one of the strongest parts of the book, is the way in which Jane is kind of has to catch herself and say, oh, I maybe don't know everything, right? Um, but you do a really great job of moving those conversations around. And so, yeah, and from my perspective, as somebody who's an outsider from this community completely, but has some tangential points of connection, both with students I taught and people I live next to. It was really informative of me about a community that I really knew almost nothing about.
Yeah. Something that I talk about a lot is the fact that even for me, I learned about the Vietnam War in my American history class. You know, um, that was really jarring for me to kind of see these really graphic images of Vietnamese refugees and, these um, kind of horrifying images of war and not have knowing that this is like where we came from and not having a ton of context, but then also getting most of the history from the top down, right? And what I mean by that is we learn the history of the like governmental aspects, the who made the decisions, and that stuff is really important. But for me, I really was looking for the humanity, I guess. My parents' humanity, my own, really just looking for, when a war ends, um, even in the midst of it, like there are lives impacted by it. And what happens afterwards has generational implications, whether or not we understand what they are immediately. And so my focus on this book was really to kind of highlight that when the war ends, the trauma continues. And unless we really fight to break the cycle, it will just continue on. Um, and that's, part of the healing process. I think it's what any like children of refugees, we're all struggling with how to move forward, how to love being Vietnamese while also holding this history in the back of our minds. And, keeping in context like that in America, the war, there were many sides, right? People were pro-war, against war, and you're watching another country kind of decide like about your fate. Looking back, and it's it's really tough to know like which way to turn. And I think that this book is about finding answers that help us heal and building bridges of empathy towards our parents who, um, you know, obviously have their own issues and problems, and that trauma gets passed down to us, but not holding on to that trauma and then repeating it, right? It's figuring out how to heal and then um, find a pathway forward.
Yeah, I think in this book, for people who are interested in reading it can be read simply as a book. You don't have to, like you say, it's not a history lesson. It truly is, in at its core, a story of a girl who's trying to reconcile an abusive father, a mother who's left, what responsibility do I have to a younger sibling as I have the opportunity to go to college. So all those things could read independently, um, not completely, but independently of knowing or understanding all the history, because certainly the history of the father is influential in how he perceives and handles relationships, which he's pretty abysmal at, right? He doesn't
Right.
do them very well at all, even with extended people that he sees as that he might perceive as close to him. He's pretty bad at it,
Yeah.
right? but at some ways, people could say, "Oh, it's a coming of age story." I can think of 4 or 5 other books that recently that I would pair this with and have people discuss them. But you do really a good job of showing that disconnect of a daughter who wants to be, I think, a diligent daughter, as it's been explained to her through cousins and life and the very existence of what she does, but at the same time wants to be completely independent or in charge of her own life. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yeah. I think for me growing up, I wanted so much to be perceived as American, white, if you will. I wanted to fit in, and a lot of times that meant distancing myself from what was Vietnamese. And so, the traditional garments, the I speak Vietnamese, but I never spoke it in public, I speak it at home with my parents, my grandparents, um and when I would hear people speaking it in public, I would kind of shy away from it because I'm like, we're in America, we're supposed to speak English. I really internalized this shame um, from being Vietnamese. And part of the reason why I wrote this book was because when I look at the history and what we've had to overcome, I actually find that like I'm so proud of Vietnamese people
Yeah,
for having come as far as we have. But to understand that, I think you really have to look at the historical kind of impact and how we got here. And it's a difficult book in many ways to read. I think it was difficult to write too. Um, and I feel like, but I feel like it's helping us bridge these gaps. And I feel like now, even just between my younger siblings and I do have a brother who's uh 10 years behind me, 11 years behind me, and a sister who's 13 years behind me.
wow.
And they already, in just, a half a generation, if you will,
Yeah,
um, they have so much more pride in being Vietnamese. And I think that that's in large part because um, Vietnamese people have really shown um, how adaptable they can be, but also that Vietnamese things are cool. You know, the food is really good, the
yeah,
dancing is really cool, and suddenly there's this sense of pride that I've just been so amazed and like grateful for.
yeah,
It's really kind of changed my perspective. And I think that that makes me a better person. And so I think, I'm going to segue a little bit because I was at the
sure.
Texas Book Festival and a Mexican kid came up to me and he said, I really related to your book because I have the same um, kind of cultural uh gap between my parents and I. And also he's like, he asked me, he's like, do you ever gaslight yourself and tell yourself that, you know, what you're experiencing is not that bad because what your parents had to experience is way worse? And I was like, yes, 100%. Like that's, you know, our stories as even though like I did not have to endure being a refugee, and of course that was really traumatic for my parents, what I did have to endure was traumatic also. And
Yeah,
not dismissing that, I think, is really an important part of healing so that we can break the cycle. And so that to this day has been one of the greatest conversations I've had with a reader because this is like, while this book is about Vietnam, I mean, we are seeing refugees come out of wars
yes,
all the time. We're currently in one now. I mean, it's a constant, the world is fighting a lot for one reason or another. And I think understanding the impact of what wars do to human people, I think will really help us empathize with the other and understand that, like, civilians really just, they're not part of these governmental policies, and they're not part, they just want to live their life and, you know, survive. And I think finding um other people who are struggling with the same things that you are, and also sort of seeing your history, like parallels in your history, is helpful in some ways, because you can look at, it's not maybe like if I'm looking at, comparing the Vietnamese refugee story to a Mexican border crossing story, right? They're
Yeah.
completely different, but sometimes it's easier to read about something that is similar to you, but not exact, because when something is so exact, it's really cutting. Um,
Yeah.
and something that is parallel can help you understand without having to feel such a personal um, uh, like tug, I guess.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it gives readers a filter in which they can say, "Oh, this is like my story. It's not my story, but I can use this filter to kind of make some sense. Okay, what don't I understand about my parents' generation that I should, or my grandparents' generation?" And also, I think for the refugee, um, America has a mixed reaction to this because America wants to feel noble and accepting of all these refugees, and at the same time we want to dismiss them as needy and taking of things that are ours. It's a really very difficult push, give and take. I mean, and for if you took American history in high school, you'd think that after World War II, we were the greatest saviors of Jewish people in the history of the world. Yet at the same time, in the 30s, we were rejecting boats of refugees who had to go back, and many were incarcerated if they didn't make their way to Cuba or Argentina or some other place. So we have I think this, oh, we're the great humanitarians of the world, but also this hidden knowledge that we've been pretty brutal from time to time as well. And I think so somebody who reads the book like I do as a refugee, I mean, I hope my grandkids and my kids will read this book and say, oh, well, what is my responsibility to act kindly to people who aren't me? You know,
Yeah, a hundred
what are they
percent.
going through that's not my experience? So I think that it reads a lot of ways, and I think openly, like you say, the Mexican refugee or the refugees earlier from the Balkan states who made their way to the United States. We've had waves of these in which we want to commend ourselves for being great, but have we always been great? Have we made the pathway for their children easy?
Yeah.
I'm not sure we've always done that in some ways, so it remains difficult. So
Yeah, I think when we look at governmental impact on civilian life, there, I think when we perceive, like I was telling people that, or I was telling a friend of mine that, I think when you pick up a book, the great thing about books is that when you turn the pages and you immerse yourself in the story, that person becomes your friend. And it becomes really hard to then look at your friend and say, you know what? I don't care that you're being bombed. You couldn't do that, right?
right.
Your friend is someone who is beloved to you, and you will immediately have empathy. And I think that that's why it's so important to read diverse books, read widely, because then every single person that that is encountering a struggle becomes someone that you can relate to, whether or not you know them personally.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Well, I personally know I'm healthier if I'm reading, right? I become less self-absorbed. I don't think about myself all the time. Reading opens windows to other possibilities and other realities that I want to consider, right? And so if I'm reading, like I say, I'm finding new friends and finding new and often better ways to look at the world, right? If I'm reading. Well, so you said you struggled this for a long time, and if people look you up on Amazon, you have an older book. So how long have you considered yourself a writer, and what kind of career have you done to get to this point where you've got this book that I hope gets even more play than it has? So
Thank you. Um, I think every day I wake up, I still wonder if I'm a writer. Um, I started writing. I mean, I think I've probably told myself stories throughout the years, like but I never really considered myself a writer. Um, I think, in high school, I was probably like a B plus English student, right? I wasn't at the top for English by any means, and I would say most of my classmates were far better writers than I was. I went to UCLA for college, and I just sort of I went in undeclared, and then I was walking around the campus and I wandered into the film school. And at the time, I think it might still be the same today, UCLA Film School only accepts 30 students,
yeah,
15 from within UCLA and 15 from outside of UCLA. So I had no chance of getting in. I had zero background knowledge or whatever, but I took an application and I filled it out and uh, with the help of my roommate at the time, and I got an interview miraculously. And I was sitting outside the interview, and I remember this girl came out. She was like the interviewee before me, and then one of the professors came out, and she said, "I'll just need a minute." And she had tears streaming down her face. So I was just like, "Oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to follow this girl who just made the professors all cry." Um, and so about 15 minutes later, I'm brought into this room with three interviewers, and we're having this conversation, and they started talking about the sample pages that I had sent in, which was a 5-page scene that I wrote about my mom getting a phone call from Vietnam about her brother being stuck in a re-education camp in Vietnam.
yeah,
And that same professor started crying again, and I realized that she had been crying because she had just read my essay. Um, and that, I think, was the first time that I realized that I could tell a story with emotional impact.
yeah.
So I did end up getting into film school. Um, and I did 2 years of screenwriting, and I worked in the industry for I think 5 or 6 years. But I didn't really have as strong of a connection with screenwriting as I did with prose. So I was working 2 jobs at the time in Los Angeles, and I quit them both. I moved to Houston. I told myself I would do it in 1 year. It took me 3. I gave myself the time to write a book. So I wrote my first book, which was an adult book, Blue Sun, Yellow Sky. This one. Um, which to me was like a masterclass in writing. I really wrote it so that I could know that I could write, because I always knew that if I was going to tackle my parents' story, I wanted to be sure that I could write well.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I'd started in 2011, took until 2023 for my father the Panda Killer to be published. It's been quite a journey.
Well, well, I'm glad you kept the journey, and it's not easy to make those commitments to write. And I have a son who lives in Burbank right now, who's trying to write screenplays and stuff, and his wife's got a good job with Apple and some other things, and so he took a year off, and he's going to give it a year to do full time. And he says, well, because he knows that I know a lot of writers and other things, and I said, Walker, the only thing I know is that writers write. If you're a writer, you're just going to figure out how to write, and you deal with what people say about your work, but if you're a writer, you just keep writing. And I find that every time I have a conversation with someone like you or others, well, I'm just going to write, and I'm writing, and I have this relationship with prose, And I thought, well, good for you. So yeah, I love that. Well, every day I wake up, I wonder if I'm still a writer. Well, I'm pretty convinced you're a writer. Now you convince yourself, and that'll be
Thanks.
good. It's go with the next one. So when I also, one of the questions that I pose to people all the time is, I love the cover of this book, because even though it's My Father the Panda Killer, it's the picture of this girl with kind of a tropical background or something. So yeah, here you go. It's very
Yeah.
interesting. So did you have a lot of say in this cover, or is this what the publisher got for you?
Um, I so the publisher brought me three artists, and said, these are the three we're looking at. And the moment I saw Marcos's work, I was like, oh my gosh, I want him. His work just has a flow to it. There's movement that I really
Yeah,
love. And I just there was something about the way that he creates work that I was like, I want Marcos. And the publishers were really great because they sent me versions every like along the way. So he would send them sort of where he was at in the process, and then they would uh send me his sketches, and then I would give notes. But mostly my notes were just, can I see more Marcos Chin in this? Because I really wanted, and I told Marcos too, I was like, for me, like, yes, this is my book, but this is our cover. Like,
yeah,
I really feel like he is infused in this cover. And I love that about it because he's such an amazing artist, and it really shines through in the book. Like he read the whole book, and he really understood Jane's journey. I
yeah,
think that um yeah, like I was blessed. I think, and I know that that doesn't happen for everyone
right.
I've talked to other authors who have got very little say, or, didn't love but I just got so lucky with this cover.
Well, I think there's a lot of good illustrators right now, so it can be easier to get lucky with so many out there. But for me, I love how the title, the fact that there's a young woman on it, suggests that there's a young woman in this story besides the father who's the panda killer, right? So the very subtle nature of the art implies a bigger thing than might first be seen in the title. So I think it's a really great cover, to think about those. And like you say, you're lucky because there will be there'll be people saying, "Oh, I had no say in it. I wish
Yeah.
that we could redo it still today."
Um, So the next book that I'm working on is a companion book to this one. It's Paul and the Mom's Story.
Oh,
And Marcos is working on that cover, so I'm so excited to have these two books paired together.
yeah, that'll be great. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when's the due date for that? Are we out a year, or what are we
I
looking at?
th- I the publishers just had the kickoff last month in-house, so I think we are looking at summer maybe 2025.
Okay, good. Well, it gives us something to look forward to, and yeah, yeah, I think it's a book that should be read and read. And again, I'm a big fan of, since I've been around Alan and some of those things a long time. I love, um, when you set up an Allen workshop. The publishers are always trying to get you to take new authors, right? But sometimes people want an established author to grow an audience because teachers and others don't know these new authors. But I've been a fan of new authors. Like um, I met Padma Venkatamaran when she had a book and no one knew who she was. And I read the book and I said, this book is fantastic. I need to know a little bit. And then Padma and I have been friends now for almost 15 years, because I thought, yeah, you're a writer. This is good. I want to see the next book and the next book. And but I think they're always waiting. So I've always been really willing as an academic to read first books, and I'm always anxious for second books because I want to know, okay, is there staying power, right?
Yeah.
And and I'm sure the writers yourselves are going, oh, I hope my second book has staying power,
Yeah,
right?
I'm wondering that too. I mean, what I'm excited about the second book is so initially when I wrote the book, I didn't have plans for a second book. I sort of pitched the idea kind of off the cuff to do a Paul story when I sold the book, and then Crown Books bought it as a two-book deal. So then I was like,
Oh,
okay,
good.
I'm writing Paul's story. um, but I really what I'm loving about the what Paul's story is that um they're not the same, and something that I talk about a lot and what I love about my sibling relationships is that we all grew up in the same household. We have very different perspectives.
Yeah,
And I think that talking about we how we come out of situations with even though we theoretically had the same exact situations growing up, how we think so differently um,
yeah.
is fundamental to the second book. But one of the things that I like to suggest for teachers who are talking about My Father the Panda Killer is that I always like for them to kind of open up the door to asking students whether or not they think that Jane should forgive her father. I think that it's really important to give um, people space to make decisions that are counter to, what you would expect. And I think that it's a very valid question and something that is easily explored. And I think will help students realize that there is no one particular answer. The pathway to healing is different for everybody. And, you have to find kind of your personal doorway in. And so I like for people to discuss the fact that like, hey, maybe if this was me, I wouldn't forgive the dad. I would do things differently or you know, I think those are really important conversations.
Okay, in light of what you ask teachers to do, what do you do on a school visit? What are the kind of things you hope to accomplish, or what kind of range of things do people ask you to do as well?
Um, I what I hope to accomplish is well, I guess it depends on what I'm talking about. If I am talking about to students who want to be writers, then I really focus on emotional impact. Um, when I lived in Los Angeles, I used to substitute teach inside downtown LA's Central Juvenile Hall. And one of the things that I found was so impactful was the fact that, like, despite not having proper grammar or language, the stories that these kids told were full of emotion. And so it didn't matter whether or not they knew how to spell or could, string together a proper sentence. The emotional impact of the stories that the kids were telling usurped any sort of technical challenges. And so I really like to talk about the fact that everybody has a story within them. And even if you're just writing in a daily diary, all of the things that you're going through, because we all know that like teenagers have it the hardest. And what they're going through is, you know, it's a lot. You have school, you have family, you have friends, and you're trying to navigate all of it. Um, and I think that when you sit down to write and you internalize your struggles, it's a lot clearer uh, for you to be able to see like kind of what your real problems are. And so writing is a tool to get things off your chest for sure, but also helps you to be able to see the things you really want a little more clearly. Um, so one of the things I like to talk about is, you know, how to kind of dig deep and be honest in your storytelling, even if you feel a lot of shame in doing it, because I think that the things that you're afraid of, the things that really scare you about, yourself are things that other people are struggling with too. And
Yeah.
being honest about how you feel about it and then how you overcome it is one of the greatest ways in which we really connect with each other. And so automatically, I think emotion always connects with readers. Um, when I
Yeah, I
do
love that.
school,
I love that. That I wish more teachers would worry about let them tell the story and let's worry about the mechanics later, some other time, if ever, right? If ever, for sometimes. So I
yeah,
love that.
thank you. Yeah, I mean, what you get out of it when you do it is amazing work. I mean, I still keep a lot of it, just
Yeah,
because I'm so inspired by the students' writings, and it reminds me that, like, vulnerability, especially in writing, is so powerful. Um, but then the other visits I do, like if I'm talking specifically about My Father the Panda Killer, is I sort of like to talk about the fact that this book really should be paired with when the students are learning about the Vietnam War in their American history classes.
yeah,
Um, I think that when you read a book about one specific person and you really understand her journey, the way in which you interpret your textbooks is going to be so different. And it's really powerful to be able to look at the human side of war when you're studying the history of a war. It becomes a lot more difficult to differentiate who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. And, you know, I think it allows us to understand the complexities and the nuances of war in a really emotional way. And I think that people then understand that, like, the trauma that comes out of these wars has a real impact on people. But also, when you're sitting there in these classrooms learning about the Vietnam War and your friend over there, the Vietnamese American student, is, you know, trying to hide in her seat, I
yeah,
think you kind of really then understand that, like, hey, this person probably needs a friend and probably needs to understand that, like, you are supportive of this, her journey being here. And, I think that it helps us just really make connections with each other that help us understand each other and allow us to be open with one another. And build really strong friendships this way.
yeah. That's so often we think about and this kind of recurs as something in your book as well, is that the story of the Vietnam War, as often told in American schools, is monolithic and is about America's experience, forgetting kind of entirely that it's a conflict within a country. It's a civil war. It's got unique divisions between North and South that in some ways um, when we try to explain them, we're missing that explanation. We don't even consider that explanation. So I think having that kind of paired personal narrative that really does give us a glimpse of both sides through this book would be a really interesting pairing. And I did a lot of work with that when I was in at the university. I paired with social studies teachers quite a bit, thinking about what young adult book would pair with this event, right? Whether it's the Great Depression, if we talk about the Great Depression and we miss Southern Black life in the 30s, then we're not really telling the entire story of the Depression. So there's lots of ways you can make the story bigger instead of monolithic and having one version of it. So I like that. That suggestion is good because I'm supposing that sometimes people who haven't read your book will want you to come in and kind of give some kind of sanitized, um, Vietnamese American version of the Vietnam War. And you think, I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to give you a human experience that
Yeah.
maybe is independent of the history of the war as it's been expressed, right? Um, so you might have to do some eggshell dancing as you say, no, this is the story I want to tell.
Yeah. A little bit. I mean, um I think that people are starting to come around to, and I kind of attribute this to the fact that there are a lot of adult books actually written by Vietnamese, especially recently,
Yeah,
um, that have sort of risen in popularity. And so it's I think it has helped open up the eyes of Americans in terms of understanding that it's not as clean, like clear cut as we'd like to think. Um, and you know, I think one of the things that was really important to me was to show like a family sort of torn apart also by the war, and being split on both sides, because that happened a lot.
yeah,
It's not a unique situation. When my parents were, I remember like my dad talking about two brothers who came face to face amid war, and then, two guns pointed at each other. Do you shoot? And like that scenario is some like I remember when he talked about it, I never forgot it because I thought, of course not. But then you're on opposite sides, and you just and so it really created this really kind of sad dynamic, in terms of like familial relationships that really had to
yeah,
be rebuilt. And I think that we don't think about the impact, because you just think, oh, it's this side or this side, but it's a lot more complex than that. Yeah.
yeah. I think it's it's always complex, and that's one of the things that I think, again, I'm going to say this over and over again, the strength of your book is that you really get at tough emotions pretty well, you know.
Thank you.
And letting people explore as Jane does and as her father does, and even as her brother does, as a very young character without a lot of words. There's moments where it's very touching between the two of them, where he's more insightful than perhaps she thinks he is, um, as she's trying to make sense of her own world. So let me, and you kind of toyed with this. You said you struggled with it for a long time. So is your in through character or plot or a central question? So kind of nail that down for me, because you said when you finally came to Jane, you did something else. But how do you approach writing that way?
I usually start with a moment. There's usually a moment that is super simple, where usually I will write tons of different scenes, and then I'll find one where the character really kind of comes to life for me. And um, in My Father the Panda Killer, it happened to be the very first scene of, when she's walking to school, and her mom has just left her, and she's running scared, and you can feel this anticipation building,
Mhm.
and who is there to rescue her dad. I think that it's a singular moment like that that usually tells me that I have a person here that I care about, and a journey that I want to explore. And it So usually I start with like one moment, and then I am one of those writers that most people don't want to be, in that I do not outline anything. I just write. I write a very terrible first draft, that usually is missing a third of an ending. And then I'll go back and rewrite. Once I usually I write in such a messy way that really I am the only person that will understand what's happening, because I'll change tenses throughout. I'm really just trying to figure out where I'm going as
Yeah,
I'm going. It's kind of like driving in the dark. But then I'll hit a place where I realize, like, okay, I am struggling to find an ending because I did not build in enough at the beginning. So then I just sort of start all over again and repeat this process. So it's very tedious. I don't recommend it. Outlines are excellent if you can do that. It's just never been I've done outlines and then I just never stick to them.
You know, say,
So
well, maybe some people would argue that you're just drafting an outline in your first draft, right? So you can get all the big ideas down and the scenes that come to you down. Well, you know, I've I've taught writing and been around people who write, for so long now that I'm quite sure there's no one way to do it, you know,
yeah.
and and I'm what I have come to find out is that most people really are more comfortable with their work in the what they would call their second or their third draft, right? And that's sometimes horrible for students to hear. But they have to write it three times, yeah, and maybe they'll write it six or seven
Yeah.
times, right? You know, and they students just don't want to, 10th graders don't want to hear that. No, no, you know, and I think yes, it's writing's hard work. I used to say even academic writing, I would say there's no such thing as writing. There's only rewriting, right? You just are constantly rewriting. And, I have a lot of academic work that doesn't look anything like the first draft, it just,
Yep.
it, where you needed to go was somewhere else different. And you didn't maybe know that till you had a hole. And then you take it apart and then you think, okay, let's put this whole back together.
Yep.
So I think that's interesting to start with a moment. That's really good. So then when you have people write moments, right? If, you're trying to get them to have that moment or that scene that'll have that real emotion, right? That'll have something that transcends beyond the page to somebody says, "Oh, wait a minute. Okay, here's an emotion or an idea or a theme that I can build on." That's fantastic. So the next book you're working on, I have one more kind of, maybe it's a tough question. You don't want to answer it. Say, no, I'm not answering that. How has it been received by family and other Vietnamese Americans? And do you know if there's any plans to release it in Vietnam?
Um, no plans for a Vietnam release. Um, although I have friends in Vietnam who have read it, so somehow they've found it. Um, and my family, so it's interesting. My family has been incredibly supportive. My parents came to my California book launch. But it's interesting because my parents cannot read English. And I tell people all the time that I think that while that's unfortunate, this book could never have existed in the way it does if they could. I think I really had to like shut off um the part of my brain that worries about their reaction.
Uh-huh.
But my parents know, I mean my dad, he picked up the book and he's like, "My father the panda killer. This is not good for me." And I'm like, yeah. So he knows. But also what's in the book is not going to be shocking to my parents. Like we've talked about how I grew up and um my I feel like I'm very fortunate in the fact that my parents and I over the years have had many conversations and my dad has apologized for like how he raised us. I mean, in part it was he was very stressed out, trying to kind of build a new life in America. He didn't really know better. And getting an apology from him, I mean, it changes everything, right? To know that your feelings are valid and that the other party really like cares. It kind of helped um heal a lot of the things that I was feeling growing up. So my parents are really proud. I think that despite the um familial trauma that plays out in the book, um my parents have always felt that the Vietnamese story hasn't been told enough. And so they're so excited to see, a Vietnamese person on a cover,
Yeah.
in a real brick and mortar bookstore.
Bookstore. Yeah.
Yeah, my mom went out. My mom went to Barnes and Nobles and she bought 3 copies. And I was like, Mom, there's not going to be any left. Like, they're super excited. And all of my cousins did read the book prior to it coming out,
Oh, good.
some of them, and they were really helpful and instrumental in, helping guide kind of where the book went. But, sort of similar to what happens in the cousins chapter, like no one is super shocked by any of the information that's in the book. And
Yeah.
and so it was, I think it's it has been nice for my family to sort of see, our story, in the world. And then to be honest, I was so scared of other Vietnamese people reading the book. I was talking to another author, Min Lay, about that because he's like, "Oh yeah, I'm scared every time a Vietnamese person says they read my book," and it's because you want them to love it,
Yeah.
obviously. But I have been honestly just shocked by the amount of support that I've been getting. I've had people messaging me on Instagram or emailing me through my website,
Mhm.
just saying that, like, they really felt seen, and they laughed, they cried, like they really felt like it was a really kind of honest portrayal of our experience. Um, the audiobook narrator, for the book, actually, I remember she she followed me on Instagram, and then, in the middle of recording the book, she said, "After I'm done recording this book, we really have to talk." And I was so nervous. I was like, "Uh-oh, like, does she have problems with the book? Is she gonna" I was just, so we scheduled a call for 3 days later. And of course, like, I couldn't think about anything else for
Anything
3
else?
days. But we got on the call, and she was so effusively positive about the book. She bought the book for she runs an organization, that, helps, I think it's a I'm gonna botch this. She runs like charitable organization, that really kind of helps people, understand the refugee experience, and um, how to like overcome traumas. And so she bought the book for everyone that works for her
Wow.
and told them that they had to read it, so they could understand generational trauma. Um, and so I I've just had a lot of really amazing support from the Vietnamese community, which has been really, really nice.
That's great. Well, it's been great talking to you, and I'm gonna when we post it, I'll promote it and do everything I can to get more people to read it because I think you've done a great job, and we're certainly happy that you're part of our in conversation on Dr. Bickmore's Why Wednesday. Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for reading the book and for sharing it and talking about it. I really, really appreciate it.